Sequels are something I've always had a problem with. The main reason is because the moment you hear the word sequel, you start to consider everything that can go wrong. And it's kind of a gamble as to whether or not it's worth seeing something like that. It's essentially just watching someone tack something else onto a film that you may have already enjoyed, like Lost Boys and Lost Boys 2. I actually have no desire to see Lost Boys 2, ever. And the main reason is because Lost Boys is about 20 years too late to exist. Because by the time they'd made it, it was about 20 years later. If it had occurred to them to make it earlier, I may have considered watching it. I mean, considered watching it. Didn't mean I would watch it. I don't know if it's actually good. If anyone's seen it and they say it's good, I will take your word for it, but I'm still not going anywhere near that thing. Anyway. Some sequels are kind of good on expanding on the story, particularly if the first film wasn't very good at explaining everything that was happening, and you care very little about the original film anyway, then there's no harm in seeing the sequel. And if the sequel was planned to exist, like the Harry Potter films, there was a sequel, there are a load of sequel films, there are a load of sequel books. They are basically carrying on the storyline. Lord of the Rings as well, but these are again books based on. There are very few films where it's a series of films that was just made to stand, that were just, yeah. Um, that they were meant to exist as a series. Then you get stuff like, well, any other sequel, like the Terminator films. This is really bad, but as a film student, I've not really sat down and watched a Terminator film all the way through, and I don't really plan to. But Terminator films were not meant to, well, they didn't have a sequel prepared. You know, they didn't write the first script and say, oh, hang on, I'm going to write the second script. Yeah, they waited a few years. When they realised the popularity of it, they made another one. And some sequels have so little to do with the original film that even if it's a bad sequel, it could still be a good film. This is where it gets weird with sequels. That's why it's a gamble. If it's got so little to do with the original film, then but it's still a good one, then sometimes it's kind of worth going to see it. Maybe not in the cinema, or maybe renting it or something like that, so even if you don't like it, you don't have to keep it forever. Two good examples of this are Grease 2 and Cruel Intentions 3. As sequels, they are very, very bad sequels. I mean, right. Grease 2, for example. Sandy had this British cousin who was previously mentioned in the first film. The Pink Ladies and T-Birds reappear, and Frenchie does as well. The reason she did it was because she dropped out in the first film, and then, at uni, high school, and she decided to go back to do a different course. Now the difference is that it's the girl who's the bad, kind of bad girl kind of thing, and the main guy is the geeky, well-mannered one, the foreign kid with good principles, but not American wild child principles, which seem to happen in films quite a lot. And he goes through this transformation to be a bad boy, so he essentially turns into the new Danny Zuko. There's also this weird rule that has come up in between the first film and the second film, is that the Pink Ladies and the T-Birds can only go out with each other. Presumably that's because that's how it came across to the new generation of T-Birds and Pink Ladies, but let's think about it this. You didn't see any of the younger generation in the first film, and the T-Birds and the Pink Ladies only got together by pure coincidence that they just sort of matched up like that. It just sort of worked out like that in the first film, but it didn't mean that every Pink Lady from then on had to go out with a T-Bird. It just kind of ended up like that. It was very weird. It doesn't make sense. They actually say in the film, oh, only T-Birds can go out with Pink Ladies. And then, for some reason, they also changed the transport of choice is motorbikes, not cars. So they're racing around in motorbikes. How you make this film Grease 2 not a Grease film? Well, obviously you change the name. But you could also rename the gang, so T-Birds and Pink Ladies, call them something else. Remove Frenchie, because there is actually no point in her being there. You could easily insert a character that shows Michael around the school so he understands what's going on. Someone who's maybe in the year that Michael's in and not older. Just she was thrown in probably to just sort of link everything up. Michael could easily just be a British guy, or he could not have been a British. He could have just been some geeky guy that came from another school. He did not have to be Sandy's cousin. And then wouldn't have been too hard to change any of that in the scriptwriting process. The songs themselves are good, and it's fairly interesting, and it's a good film, provided you completely forget that Grease was better. And the other one I mentioned was Cruel Intentions 3. It has similar concepts to the first film in that they're messing with people, but there are three people who are messing with people now instead of two people. And the main girl is again a cousin, not like a very, the loosest relationship possible to Catherine, the psycho bitch from the first film. And they mention this once in the beginning, and if they didn't do that and they again titled it differently, it probably would have been a good film. Not as popular, maybe, but yeah, it would have been a good film. And people might have compared it to Cruel Intentions, but you could just easily say, well, it was based off of that, but it's not the same thing. And because I mentioned Cruel Intentions 3, you're probably asking me why I didn't mention Cruel Intentions 2. And that is because it's not a sequel, it's a prequel, and I guarantee that it isn't worth your time at all. In fact, Cruel Intentions 2 should not exist. This is why I get weird about it. Cruel Intentions 2 is basically a very bad prequel. Sequels are bad enough, but, they kind of... If they expand on the universe a bit, then they're okay, and if they're good films in their own right, then they're okay. If they're a very bad sequel, the most you can do is cut them out. Prequels are trying to tell you what happened before, to, again, explain a bit more. If you watch a prequel after the first film's been made, then you're kind of just sitting there going, hang on, this makes no sense, especially if it does actually make absolutely no sense in the context. I mean, one decent prequel I have seen would be, I don't know, recently, X-Men First Class. I mean, there are a load of inconsistencies in it. For example, Eric, in one of the films, claims that he helped build Cerebro, but that was absolute bullshit, and no point did they mention that he helped build Cerebro. They also haven't indicated a relationship between Azazel and Mystique, and if that doesn't happen, then where the fuck is Nightcrawler gonna come from? But that's just, that's basically my rant about sequels and prequels. Prequels are even more dodgy territory than a sequel is. I'm gonna stop ranting now, finish my tea, and eat some stroopwafels. I really, really like the word stroopwafel. Please tell me if I'm saying this wrong.